welcome back to another no-code video, and in this one we're going to be looking at the basics of the WAMZ stack. Now that might just sound like something I've made up, but actually it stands for Webflow, AirTable, MemberStack and Zapier, and it's essentially a way of using these 4 different tools together to create fully fledged custom web apps. It's quite different from other stuff we've looked at before, like Bubble, Adalo, Glide, Backendless, etc., because all of those tools are what we call all-in-one builders. They have everything you need from the front end through to the back end, through to the database, and you can build more or less whatever you like in them. The WAMZ stack, on the other hand, is focused on web apps. You can build web apps that work on mobile, but broadly it's focused on web apps. And what you get is a trickier learning curve, but you get endlessly more flexibility. Because where a tool like Adalo or Glide or Bubble, all those tools are focused on how do you do everything within the one platform, and that can be pretty hard to get right. Look at Adalo, for example. It's uber powerful, but it's hard to do, pixel perfect designs exactly the way you want them. The branding tools at the minute are limited versus, say, Webflow. On the other hand, if you look at Glide, again, it's really, really easy to build something. It handles all aspects from a database through to workflows, through to the visuals. But again, something like Zapier or something like Airtable are going to be better at workflows or databases respectively. And so the idea of the WAMZ stack is to add a little bit of complexity by introducing all of these tools. But off the back of that, you're going to get a ton more flexibility because you can use all of these different tools together. You can get the strengths out of them, you can negate the weaknesses, and ultimately build something really flexible. Now, it's something we've talked about a lot on the No-Code website already. We've got all these different tutorials on the WAMZ stack, and indeed the No-Code website itself is actually built using the WAMZ stack. You've got everything that you see is available on Webflow. Everything that you interact with is done with Zapier. All of the tools that we have are all stored on Airtable. And of course, if you go up the top right hand corner and hit login, that is controlled entirely by MemberStack. Now, we call it a stack because stack is just a word that's used in the programming world to refer to multiple tools used together to create some sort of outcome. We use WAMZ because that gives us the kind of key components. We've got Webflow for the login, we've got Airtable for the underlying data, we've got MemberStack to allow the login functionality, and we've got Zapier for the workflows. But you could change all of those tools out. Instead of Webflow, you could use something different like Squarespace or Wix. Instead of Airtable, you could use Google Sheets, for example. Instead of MemberStack, you could try Outsetter or something else. And of course, instead of Zapier, you could look at NAN, or you could look at Integromat. And you might also add other tools in there. You might not need all the tools. Quite often people don't need Airtable or they don't need MemberStack, and that's completely okay. It's just about getting a way of thinking about the tools, getting that in your head, and realising that WAMZ can probably solve a lot more problems than you might first realise. So let's have a quick look at each of the individual tools. Clearly we've got Webflow, and I'm going to dive into that in a little bit more detail in just a second, but this is where the entire front end is handled. The UI, the UX, everything the user sees, everything the user interacts with, all happens here. Airtable, you're probably already familiar with. If you haven't already, highly, highly, highly recommend checking out our Fundamentals of No-Code series with the 4 different pillars, which are essentially encapsulated within this entire WAMZ stack. Now, it doesn't map perfectly. Clearly Webflow takes care of the front end, so the UI and the UX pillar. Clearly Airtable takes care of the database pillar, and clearly Zapier takes care of the workflows pillar. But Zapier also takes care of APIs and integrations pillar, whereas MemberStack doesn't really fit any of the pillars. It's not quite back end and workflows. It's kind of somewhere in between, and that's okay. It's not designed to map it perfectly, but you can see how all of the elements of the 4 pillars are encapsulated in these 4 tools. Anyway, within that series we talked a lot about Airtable, and so you'll probably be fairly familiar with that if you have looked. If you haven't, as I say, pause and go take a look at that. We then obviously have Zapier, which we're going to look at in terms of workflows. So when something happens, we're going to take one or more actions. And then we'll be looking at MemberStack, where not only can you take payments and sign people up to stuff, but you also have a login system, you also have user accounts. So over the next few videos, we're going to explore every one of these. We'll look at how you can set MemberStack up. We'll look at how you can create a new Zap. We'll look at how you can configure your Airtable database, send data to it, read data from it. And of course, we'll look at Webflow in more depth. But let's start right here. I've actually created this demo project earlier. It's called Rate My Doggy. And essentially, it's just a little idea I've come up with to demonstrate what the WAMZ Stack can do. But we're going to build a website where people can look at a bunch of different cute dogs and leave some sort of comment on them. And it's just really a good way of us showing how do you display data on Webflow, how do you store that data on Airtable and then pass it back when you need it, how do you take data submitted on Webflow, pass that through Zapier and do something with it, and of course how do you hide it all behind a login system using MemberStack. So let's just kind of get started with the basics of Webflow. Now I'm going to attempt to just show you the basics of the interface and how it all kind of works, but Webflow themselves do have this incredible Webflow University. I recommend checking it out. It has got incredible content on pretty much every element of Webflow you could ever need to know. But let me talk you through the basics you need to get started. Now, down the left hand side, we've got all the kind of components you might want to add, the pages you might want to add, CMS items, and I'll come back to that in a second. Whereas on the right for each individual component, we've got the configuration. You've got the styling options here, you've got the individual config here, and then you've got things like animations or styles that you probably don't need to worry about too much when you're just starting out. But if we pop in the left here, we've got all these different components, and if you did watch the Fundamental series and you've seen the UI and UX pillar, then a lot of these images will probably be familiar because I spent some time going through Webflow showing how all this works and how you could put together a quick interface. Within Webflow you can store various different layouts. We call that a symbol, and it just means you can create something reusable. Imagine you had a newsletter sign up box and you wanted to use that on multiple parts of your website and different pages. You can turn that into what Webflow calls a symbol. It's a little bit like a template, for example, and you can use that again and again throughout. I'll skip this a little bit for now, I'll show you that later, but we also have the ability to clearly add different web pages to our website or web app. You'll start out with a homepage by default, you also get password and 404, you can click create new page and add a bunch of different stuff here. And then you get Webflow CMS, and this is where Webflow really starts to shine. The CMS stands for the Content Management System, and it's essentially a little database within Webflow that you can configure however you like. The primary purpose of it is to hold some sort of website content, for example, a blog post, or if you had a website about song lyrics, then you might hold, different albums, different artists, different lyrics, etc. We can use it for whatever we want. In our case, we're going to use it for dogs, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Other elements on here include e-commerce, so you can actually use Webflow to run a really custom, cool-looking e-commerce website. Personally, we're not going to bother with that, probably do a future video on that. You can store all your assets, your images, etc. You'll see I've got one there already. And then you'll get various different settings. So the way you typically get started in Webflow, you've kind of got two options. You can pop in here and pick some different default layouts. So for example, I can drag this hero bar in, and that's immediately going to give me some different components, like a container in the middle. It's going to contain an image, it's going to contain a heading, paragraph, etc. So you can do that. That's one thing or one option. And you've got, by the way, a bunch in there. Like, it's worth exploring because they're all pretty beautiful and look like most websites. So if you're trying to create a design that already feels like something else, you'll find it in here. But the other thing that you can just do is build it yourself. So I'm going to start by doing just that, and I'm going to drag a nav bar in here. So we'll start with a nav bar up the top, and we'll just put a section element underneath. And again, if you're not 100% familiar with all these elements and what they mean and what they do, check out the components video under the UI and UX pillar. We go through all of these. But we're going to just start with a nav bar. As I say, I'm going to just drag an image in there to begin with. So we'll just have like our little brand in here. As I say earlier, I uploaded this little paw print picture. Seems a pretty good brand for a website about dogs. And I'm just going to drag that image to be exactly the size that I want, which is probably about there. Probably just going to add a little bit of margin to that, push it down a little bit. How does that look? Perfect. Okie dokie. And we'll drag a heading in as well. I'm fairly sure there's already a website called Rate My Doggy, so I might be doing something slightly breaking copyright here, but let's go with it. So we'll call this Rate My Doggy. Now this is where I get a chance to show you that menu on the side. So you can see this is showing up a little bit weird. If I click on the navigator, it essentially shows me the hierarchy of components. So the body component is always the It's the main component. You put any other component into on any Webflow site, it is always the top level component. Within that body, I've then got a nav bar. Within that nav bar, I've then got a container, and you can see the blue line highlighting that. I've then got this link for brand, which would essentially just let me click the paw image at any point to go back to the home page. I've got the paw image, which is that image there. That is within my brand link. And then I've got this heading, and if you look at the heading, it's kind of hard to tell, but it's actually outside the brand link, which means it's not shown as sort of in the hierarchy as underneath the image or next to the image. It's shown as separate from it entirely. Now, if I put that heading there, it's going to jump up on top of the paw because the paw comes after the heading. But actually, if I drag it down and put it right next to there, then they're going to end up on the same sort of in the same kind of box here. So there's a couple of things I'll do just to make this look right. Let's drop the size a little bit. Let's set it to show up alongside. And again, we do more videos on these, and Webflow University explains it pretty well. But if you put something inline block, then essentially what happens here is it will just put these two elements in line. I'll do a little bit of spacing, maybe a little bit more actually. We'll do 10 there, just to space that apart some more. And there you go. Now, does it look perfect? Absolutely not. It really doesn't, but it does the job. It gets it in there and does what we need it to do. And I can take a little bit of spacing away there. That should bring it up nicely. I'll maybe put a little bit of padding. Let's try 10, see if that spaces it out properly. Yeah, that'll do for now. So essentially you can play around with this to get it looking however you want, but this will do for now. We just want a nice, really simple little nav bar really for navigating our dog website. And as I said, this brand bit is a link. Even though you can't see it, it essentially means if I click on the paw or on rate my doggy, it's going to take me to a link. On the right hand side here, I can configure that. I can say take me to the home page, and so no matter what page I'm on in the future, even though this is the only page I've got for now, I can always come back, click that, and it will take me back and refresh the page. So I've dragged a section element in here, and that is just going to be a little bit of a container really for some of the changes I want to make here. So I'm just going to put some padding on here. First of all, I like to always kind of just put a little bit in. It gives it a little bit of spacing. It's a nice easy place to start from. I'm going to drag a container in. Oh, there we are. And I'm going to put a little heading at the very top above the container for now. We might move that later. And I'm going to write, we'll write pick a dog. This might not make sense once we design it properly, but again, I'm just kind of trying to show this idea of how a website goes from nothing to kind of being together. And essentially what we're doing here is we're just dragging in these different components, we're layering them in, and then we're making little styling changes to them. So I've just set that to be center aligned. I'm going to set that to a different font. Let's go with Merriweather, that looks kind of cool. And then we've got a container. Now, one of the things I like to do, I've talked about this before, but just I'll remind you of this design tip. I love this website called, I guess you pronounce it, Coolors.co. And whenever you go on this website and hit the space bar, it just comes up with new colours. It comes up with a new colour palette for you to try. And you know those colours are always going to work nicely together. So I can just keep hitting space until I get to a colour palette that I'm happy with. Don't like any of these just yet. Do I like that one? No, let's keep going. And you just keep going, and as you can see, it shows you all these different colours. They all work in tandem. You can use them for your design and just make something really nice looking. We're going to go with this one. Again, it's not really the best looking, but it'll do. And when you click that, that essentially gives you what we call the hex code. Again, if you remember from the UI and UX course, the hex code will essentially let us figure out what a colour is specifically, instead of having to say, well, it's kind of green, it's kind of dark green, etc. So I'm going to set this section's background to that hex colour. I'm going to set the body background to that colour as well, and that will just make it look all like that. In terms of our container, I'll set that for a colour for now. It won't really show anything up because there's nothing in the container, so the container is actually invisible. If I hit that, then you can't see it. But we'll set a background so we've got it anyway. Try this. Not sure how green on yellow is going to look. Probably pretty horrible. But let's go with it for now. Actually, let me try this. This might look a little bit better. If you're a designer watching this, you're probably cringing. That's okay. Just trying to give you an idea of how you can use these palettes. We'll also set our nav bar to be that green as well. We'll set that, and then we'll set our dog text to be white. How's that look? Terrible. It looks absolutely dreadful, but let's stick with it for now. So I just wanted to give you a basic idea of what the layout's going to look like on Webflow. The next thing that we're going to do in the next video is we're going to go ahead and set up Airtable. So we'll set this up. We'll also set up our CMS. We'll look at how we can get everything ready to start putting dog data in here and then letting people leave a review. So far we've just covered basic layout. We'll go into more of the in-depth components that Webflow has for layout, like repeating data lists or a collection list as Webflow calls it, and then we'll start to bring it together shortly.